Thank you for having me. I look forward to discussing some basic ideas related to the philosophy of nonviolence. This is based upon my own study of nonviolence, and it's a summation of what I've learned so far in my study of nonviolence. Next slide, Gene. So it's based upon Martin Luther King's philosophy, as well as Gandhi, Khan's, who was a contemporary of Gandhi in India and later in Pakistan, who advocated nonviolence from an Islamic perspective. Gene Sharp is pictured there as well. You read some pieces from Gene Sharp, a strong influence in my own thinking about nonviolence, and also the 20th century philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who's pictured in the right-hand corner. These are my primary influences in understanding nonviolence, among other thinkers and activists. Next slide. So there are basically 5 elements, as I understand it, of the philosophy of nonviolence. These 5 are the foundations of the philosophy in terms of dignity, equal dignity and freedom, justice, injustice, moral duty to resist injustice, and then the understanding of nonviolence or nonviolent direct action as direct resistance and conflict transformation. I'll briefly outline these 5 elements here today. You can, next slide. So the foundations, the philosophical foundations of nonviolence are grounded in the idea of dignity, the idea that each person, every human being, possesses an equal inherent dignity. And this is a normative assertion and a presupposition that every human being should be considered as possessing an equal and inherent value. This is also often grounded in certain religious and metaphysical beliefs as well, from Gandhi, King, Khan, among others, that the human beings have a sacredness to them. They are divine sparks, and therefore are in possession of a fundamental dignity. However, that claim of dignity can also be asserted as just a normative assertion, a normative assumption, without reliance on any particular metaphysical belief. So dignity, the idea of dignity, is a preeminent moral good or moral value that animates nonviolence and its struggle against injustice. As Martin Luther King put it, man must never be treated as a means, but always as an end within himself. And here we have, I believe that Martin Luther King here is also deeply influenced by Immanuel Kant's second categorical imperative, that to always treat humanity in ourselves and in others as an end and never as a means. And in turn, each person's dignity finds expression in a sense of self-respect. So dignity is intimately interconnected with self-respect and the preservation of self-respect as foundational to nonviolence. Next slide. This dignity is operationalized in terms, also in terms of freedom, as Martin Luther King stated, to deprive man of freedom is to regulate him to the status of a thing rather than elevate him to the status of a person. So what follows from equality and equal inherent dignity is a fundamental right to freedom, a fundamental right to to deliberate, to decide, and respond to others, to define, to conceive, plan, and execute our own choices, and to evaluate those choices. Freedom to define and pursue one's own conception of the good life, consistent with the freedom of others, follows from a fundamental moral good of dignity. Next slide. So, dignity, equality, and freedom provide the foundation for a conception of justice. And therefore, from the perspective of dignity, justice can be defined generally as what each person is due, as well as what we owe others as matters of good and right. Martin Luther King again asked, how does one determine whether a law, that is a civil law, is just or unjust? His response is, a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God, end quote. And for King, the moral law is the law of human dignity, the law of the dignity of human personality. So what at its most foundational level, what we are due is respect for our dignity, and what we owe others as a matter of justice is to respect the dignity of others. Next slide. So what a person is due is that which he values and is justified in claiming as necessary to realize a good life. And this is the essence of freedom. And that an individual has a fundamental right, a justified claim to that which is necessary for that person to realize a good life. And also, what each person is due, as I just suggested, is respect, to be respected as an end with intrinsic value. And this translates into a right to freedom to do and to be what one has reason to value. Next slide. What we owe others is a basic moral obligation to respect persons as ends. And that means to respect them as sources of agency, who have a worth and a dignity in their own right, with their own life plans to design and pursue. King argues for an overarching, unenforceable duty that in our hearts we all grant thoughtness to other human beings. There's a basic, from this perspective, a basic duty, moral duty, to treat others as ends, to respect their dignity. And therefore, dignity calls for equal moral respect. Next slide. These, what we are due and what we owe others in terms of equality and freedom translates into a conception of a just society. And for Martin Luther King, the ultimate goal of nonviolence is to create a world where men and women can live together, quoting, and that goal requires agape, or a particular kind of love, as its foundation. And when when agape defined as mutual respect and concern for others, when that is realized in community, then we have what King called the creation of the beloved community. Cornel West often describes justice as what love looks like in public. And this is the idea of the beloved community. not not love in any sentimental sense or love in a romantic sense or love even in a parental sense, but agape refers to a general sense of justice and a general respect and concern for others. And therefore, King defined integration as the welcomed participation of Negroes or any minority outgroup in general. To participate in the total range of human activities was a fundamental right for everyone, what everyone was due. And this required hospitality. It required mutual respect. So, for the goal of nonviolence for Martin Luther King and Gandhi and others is the full integration of everyone into the society, gaining equal and full participation in all society's political and social institutions. So, a just society is an equal and fair society, a beloved community. And that's the goal of all nonviolent action. Next slide. Okay. Okay. Yes. So, given that conception of justice, we turn to a conception of injustice. What is not just? And Martin Luther King, again, in his letter from a Birmingham city jail, uh, gave a clear definition from his perspective of an unjust law. Quote, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. End quote. He's suggesting that he's defining oppression and domination as unjust because it degrades and disrespects the human dignity, the human personality, depriving that personality of its full realization. So a law isn't necessarily just. Laws can be unjust, and a law that is unjust from this perspective is one that degrades human beings, degrades their dignity, and that can take the form of both oppression and domination. Oppression in the sense of exploitation, domination in terms of the imposition of power onto others. King again writes, to deprive man of freedom is to regulate him to the status of a thing rather than to elevate him to the status of a person. So any law that deprives individuals of freedom is unjust because it degrades the status of the person. It degrades the human personality. Next slide. One of the primary injustices that Martin Luther King and others have fought against is racial segregation. Any law, any social institution, any policy that segregates based upon race or perhaps other ascriptive characteristics such as social class, gender, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, etc. Any any law or policy that segregates based upon this malevolent kind of discrimination blocks the capacities of the person to deliberate, choose, and take responsibility for their lives. Um, it has the consequence of forcing people to live in some system that was largely made these a priori decisions for me, end quote. The result is that human beings are reduced to animals, to something less than human, and that's a profound violation of their human dignity. So King also writes, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up regulating persons to the status of things. So racial segregation is profoundly unjust, and that would include malevolent discrimination based upon race. It's profoundly unjust because it is dehumanizing. Next slide. The same is true for the denial of the voting franchise, the denial of suffrage based upon various ascriptive characteristics. As King wrote, the denial of the vote not only deprives the Negro of his constitutional rights, but what is even worse, it degrades him as a human being. Vote denial and segregation are injustices that reduce human beings to things. It cuts off their capacities for freedom. And also, vote denial, discrimination, segregation mark persons within a socially stratified hierarchy as having lower and higher ranks, with persons of a high rank being conferred greater dignity. So the denial of rights, of civil rights, in particular the denial of suffrage, of the right to vote, marks people as into a lower status and thereby preserves a socially stratified hierarchy. Vote right denials are similar to what has been referred to as bling laws. In Massachusetts, in the beginning of the colony of Massachusetts, laws were written that forbade certain groups of people from wearing certain kind of clothing or certain kind of jewelry, and reserved that certain kinds of clothing and jewelry to higher social class individuals, and that's referred to as bling laws. It's kind of the idea of wearing wigs in English history. The bigger the wig, the more status one had, and that was a marker of social hierarchy. Similarly, vote denial and other forms of discrimination mark people and put them into a lower level of the hierarchy. John Lewis, for example, maintained throughout his life that voting was the most important right that we possessed in a democracy, and that voting also was the most potent form of nonviolent direct action. But in general, the denial of the vote is to degrade and to keep down certain individuals in the social hierarchy, and therefore is unjust. Next slide. Another form of injustice is colonization, And this was very, colonization and imperialism were fundamental objects of injustice within the history of nonviolence. Um, Gandhi, of course, was acting involved in nonviolent direct action to undermine British imperialism and to have the British leave India. So, in a sense, Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement was fighting against a internal colonization of the United States based upon race. And many other actors of nonviolent action were also motivated by an attempt to decolonize the world. So colonization in the form of domination and oppression is also a profound form of injustice. And the colonized world is a world compartmentalized. It is, by its very nature, segregated and divided into antagonistic forces. In that sense, it is Manichaean. Colonialism also is an exertion of naked violence or naked power. It represents the imposition of an external, the imposition of coercive power to dominate and exploit an indigenous population. And this can be external, from an external power, or colonization in this sense can occur within societies. And colonization and imperialism are based upon a command conception of power, that power is based in superior military force that provides the means for obedience, for compliance, for forcing the compliance of the population. And therefore the internal border that marks the segregation of the colonized and the colonizer is the police force, the military force. And this is a point made by Francis Fanon. So the colonization is also a paradigmatic example of injustice in the nonviolent tradition. Next slide. So in summary, injustice is that which violates the dignity of the human personality and thereby the basic moral imperative of respect for persons. And this takes the forms of political domination and social oppression. On the other hand, justice requires a society, a beloved community that respects the dignity of all persons, and that is manifested in rights, in a system of rights that guarantee moral, political, and social equality, as well as the fair value of those rights. Next slide. So based upon this understanding of justice and injustice, the nonviolent tradition argues for a moral duty to resist injustice. And that's the fourth component of the philosophy, that given dignity and self-respect, everyone has the highest order interest in the protection of that dignity and respect. In a sense, one has a right to them. And all rights entail duties. The basic right to dignity and self-respect, including a system of rights and a social structure that protects them, entails a general duty to ensure the right to dignity of every person as a matter of justice. It's what we are due and what we owe others. Therefore, if we are due dignity and if we have a duty to ensure the dignity of others, then what follows logically is a basic duty, a basic moral duty to resist and reform social and political institutions, laws, policies, customs, practices that threaten or violate the rights of persons. So there's a basic nonviolence is animated by this basic duty to resist injustice that we have a basic moral obligation to either reform or abolish social and political institutions that are unjust. Next slide. There are 3 or 4 core arguments for the duty to resist injustice. One of them is the duty from dignity that I just expressed. The second argument is an argument from mutuality or reciprocity. In Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote this very famous line that I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and cannot be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Because of this mutuality, because of this interrelatedness between peoples, injustice is something that we need to address because we are intimately connected and to each other. And this is a position also put forth by Gandhi, who believed in the essential unity of humanity. So nonviolence follows from the unity and interdependence of humanity and life. Violence damages all forms of life, including oneself. To harm the other is to harm oneself. And therefore, nonviolence rests upon this awareness of mutuality and reciprocity. And because we are tied in a single garment of destiny, we have a duty to resist and transform injustice. Next slide. There's also an argument from a right to self-defense and an inherent obligation to help others in need. When dignity is threatened or violated, the aggrieved party has a right to protect itself and to restore justice and peace. And also that can be expanded, that right to self-defense, to defend against injustice is expanded into a moral obligation to help others in need, to help to protect innocent others. And that also grounds a duty to respect, to resist injustice based upon an obligation to help others. Next slide. So in summary, the duty to resist injustice follows from the duty of respect for persons, which is grounded in the duty, grounded in the right to the basic moral good of dignity. Justice demands that all persons are due respect, and therefore their dignity, we have a duty to protect their dignity and to help those whose dignity are threatened. Next slide. So we have, based upon this moral duty to resist injustice, there are arguments for violence, for using violent means, often expressed by the term "by any means necessary," and there are counter arguments for a nonviolent approach to resisting injustice. Next slide. So the argument for violence, as put forth by Francis Fanon and Malcolm X, among others, they argued for violent resistance to injustice, to exert resistance by any means necessary to transform, to eliminate the injustice. And they saw injustice in terms of a power struggle. Uh, Justice in the face of injustice cannot be achieved through negotiation or rational discourse, seeking an agreement or compromise. For Fanon and Malcolm X, there was no negotiation that would lead to the transformation of the injustice. And they argued that in open conflict, the opposing power can only be controlled or destroyed by physical force. And they were also operating from a command obedience conception of power. That to counter power as command, you had to have superior force and exert superior force against your opponent. And that was the only way to defeat the injustice, was to put forth a more powerful, physically powerful response to injustice. So from this perspective, liberation from injustice can only be achieved through the exertion of a counterforce, an equal or greater counterforce, implemented through the exercise of armed militant force. Now, those are the components of the basic argument for violence as a means to resist injustice. Next slide. Of course, the nonviolent tradition argues against the use of force in response to injustice. And there are several arguments, some of which I'll describe here. One argument is the argument from fallibility, and this was an argument put forth by Gandhi. There's a prima facie moral presupposition against doing harm to others, and therefore violation of this presumption must be morally justified. The sacrifice of the lives of others cannot be justified on the grounds of necessity, for it is impossible to prove necessity. And that is one good reason for nonviolence as our fallible judgment. Any justified grounds that we put forth for the use of violent force, which causes harm to others, rests upon our fallible judgment, and therefore we should be very cautious, if at all, to the use of violent force. The violent agent needs to know with certainty that he or she is right in terms of their reasons to use force. And human beings are incapable of knowing perfectly, with perfect certainty, that their cause is just and their means are justifiable. If our capacity is fallible, then the truth dictates that we tolerate and enter into a dialogue with each other, and not to seek to impose, subjugate, or destroy each other. Next slide. The second argument for nonviolence is a means-end argument. The argument that ends and means are interconnected, and that the means that one uses to resist injustice has within it, like a seed, the end that one is seeking. The end is pre-existent in the means, and therefore the means will determine what ends are achieved. And therefore, violent means increase. If we use violent means, the ends that we achieve will be distorted, will result in violent ends. that we can't use immoral means or violent means to attain moral ends, according to the nonviolent tradition. And also to use violent means, which is often based in hate, one's own dignity is damaged. Violence also increases fear and hatred and decreases the chance of reconciliation and the establishment of lasting justice. Violent means also do not appeal to the conscience of the opponent. Uh, they do not, violent means does not invoke disciplined suffering that can disarm and persuade opponents. In fact, it reifies their prejudice and their hatred of the actor. Next slide. Nonviolence also has a participation advantage. It has the capacity to invite and encourage participation from the general population from all different walks of life. It uses the power of socially organized masses. And therefore, there are fewer barriers to participating in nonviolent protests than there are in joining an armed movement. And this participation advantage makes nonviolence potentially more effective than violent means. A whole or significant portions of the population can be mobilized in nonviolent action. Next slide. So nonviolent means of resisting injustice can be argued as superior to violence. Nonviolence shapes nonviolent ends and therefore is more consistent with peace and justice. It appeals to the conscience of the opponent. It seeks reconciliation rather than domination, and it is consistent with the fallibility of human reason. And finally, it is more universally inclusive, the participation advantage, than violent means. So that for these reasons, one could conclude that nonviolent direct action is superior to a violent, militant approach to resisting injustice. Next slide. So now we turn to the basic elements of nonviolent resistance. Next slide. So one of the important elements of nonviolent resistance is that it's based on understanding, and it has the potential of awakening the conscience of the opponent. It doesn't seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but seeks to win the opponent's friendship and understanding. It also has the possibility of awakening a sense of moral shame in the opponent, which leads to the possibility of redemption and reconciliation. Next slide. A second element is that resistance to injustice or the object of the resistance is injustice itself. The forces of evil or the forces of injustice, rather than persons. It's focused on the injustice and not the people who are implicated in that injustice or complicit in that injustice. It doesn't seek to victimize the persons. It seeks to transform the injustice. In one phrase, it's hate the sin but not the sinner. So a second element is that nonviolent resistance focuses on actions rather than the persons doing the action. Because in the end, we want to win over them. We want to win their understanding and their friendship. in the interests of reconciliation. Next slide. Nonviolent resistance also fundamentally involves critique and dissent. It involves public social criticism, and this is a significant role for intellectual critique and political critique and moral critique of unjust laws. Dissent includes protest and protest movements against unjust laws and practices, etc. So a third element of nonviolent resistance is potently a critical thought, critique, and practices of dissent. Next slide. A fourth element is disruption and negotiation. It A part of the nonviolent tradition is the recognition that the oppressor will probably not voluntarily, on their own, submit to change or reconciliation, that in many cases it will have to be demanded by the oppressed. And therefore nonviolent direct action seeks, in a sense, to disrupt by creating a crisis through protest, through mass mobilization, through boycotting, economic boycotts, among other methods of disruption that, in a sense, will force the opponent to come to the negotiation table to confront the issue. So certain forms of protest are means of creating disruption with the intention of furthering negotiation to get really the attention of the oppressor. Next slide. This is based upon an important insight that was developed by Gene Sharp in his reading of Gandhi and King and others. And this has to do with the nature of power as consensual. The argument that power is really not about command and compliance, but power is about collective action based upon agreement, mutual agreement, and mutual consent. And that notion of consensual power is a basic assumption of nonviolent direct action. And it's the belief that the exercise of power depends on the consent of the ruled, and thereby, because power is consensual, thereby when the people withdraw their consent, that creates a shift, a profound shift in the political dynamic between the oppressed and the oppressor. The withdrawal of consent shifts or undermines the power of the opponent, and that's the purpose of many of the elements of direct nonviolent action. Is often the withdrawal of consent, and thereby shifting power to the protesters and away from those with political power who are attempting to sustain the injustice. So the withdrawal of consent is a fundamental element of nonviolent action. Next slide. Another very important element of nonviolent action is, and we alluded to this before, is the force of love, or what Gandhi called truth force. King referred to as the force of love, the love principle as agape. Agape as understanding, redeeming goodwill, the overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return, the basis of respect, a fundamental respect and concern for others in an impartial way. Gandhi referred to this as the force of truth, and that the truth of the fundamental unity of persons was of the great force that nonviolent action utilizes. So nonviolent direct action is based from this perspective on the force of love and the force of truth. That love and truth will prevail over violence and injustice. Next slide. Another element, a very important one, is self-purification. That, and I have some quotes from the Dalai Lama here, who's also an advocate of nonviolent resistance to injustice, that we need not a commitment to nonviolent action requires a commitment to critical self-examination and self-purification. It requires that we look inside of ourselves for our own, and to confront and transform our own inner demons, our own violent tendencies, and to embrace our own sense of justice before we engage in nonviolent direct action. So nonviolence requires a spiritual and moral discipline of self-purification that it presents the foundation for the nonviolent direct actor. Because without dealing with our own anger, our own trauma, our own prejudices, our own hatreds, without bringing them to the light of consciousness and transforming them, we will act them out in the world, especially if we're engaged in resisting injustice and are tempted to engage in violence. Next slide. One of the basic elements of nonviolence is the power of suffering, and the power of suffering to absorb violence is a profound method of nonviolent direct action. It disarms and imbalances the opposition. It's a kind of moral jiu-jitsu which transforms the force directed at oneself and turns it against the opponent. And it does that by, suffering does that by awakening the moral conscience of the opponent. And the recognition of suffering provides a bridge to reconciliation. Suffering by the nonviolent actor also exposes clearly the injustice that the opponent is trying to sustain. And suffering of the nonviolent protester also calls attention to the rightness of the cause, the justice of the cause. And it speaks in profound ways to the decent but silent majority. When the silent majority sees the nonviolent actor suffering at the hands of the government, then that awakens and potentially mobilizes the majority of citizens. Next slide. So those are the basic elements of nonviolent resistance as I understand them. And that those principles or elements lead to a wide variety of types of nonviolent action. There are many different types and approaches to nonviolent action. I think Gene Sharp documents over 200 types of nonviolent action. Here's a list of some of the most prominent. Protest and persuasion is a common nonviolent action. Social non-cooperation, strikes, boycotts, withdrawing from participation in the social system, having large groups withdraw from cooperation with the system. Um, Economic cooperation is a part, non-cooperation, action by consumers, economic boycotts, strikes by labor, by workers, etc., are forms of economic non-cooperation that are nonviolent actions. Next slide. Political non-cooperation is a fundamental approach. The rejection of authority, critiquing and dissenting from authority, citizens not cooperating with the government, and in particular acts of civil disobedience, the deliberate and intentional breaking of an unjust law and accepting the consequences of breaking that law, going to jail or prison in protest, illuminates the injustice of the law, and is a very significant and profound and difficult type of nonviolent action. There are also rule departures by government personnel. We've seen this in recent years, that within the government itself, government agents and officials can protest or engage in non-cooperation by blocking certain orders or not complying with certain rules that they find to be unjust. And there's a variety of non-violent interventions that range from the psychological to the physical to the social to the economic. Next slide. So in summary, in the end, nonviolence is both a normative philosophy of justice. It's grounded in certain philosophical suppositions and presuppositions, in particular normative presuppositions that ground its conception of our moral convictions of justice, of injustice. And it's also, importantly, a political strategy of transformative direct action. It strategizes how to go about transforming an unjust society or unjust institutions. And therefore it is both a philosophy and a political strategy. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm happy to continue.